it's Hailey, and today I'm going to be talking about the books that I read this past March. So no, I did not misspeak. I am going to be talking about books that I read in March. I fell very behind with like recent reads videos because as I started reading a lot more, I was having a lot of trouble like keeping up with it. So I just decided to just do monthly wrap-ups again. I'm going to try that out and see if it might help me out. But today I'm going to be talking about the books that I read in March, and then I believe the next video that I will have going up is going to be the one with books that I read this past April, because there are honestly so many books to talk about. Now we are kind of filming in a different location than usual. Usually I'll film with just like my vlog camera and have it kind of over there, but I decided to use like my actual camera and try that out, but I still have to film from the floor for right now because this little guy is still super fresh and still likes to get into things. So I am on puppy duty and we're gonna be filming at kind of an odd angle for the next little bit. I apologize for that, but I mean, I would say he's worth it. You can get some puppy shots in there too. I'm just hoping he's gonna like settle down and just sleep in my lap rather than just like wander around and cry, because he wants so much attention even though I give him all the attention. Like hopefully he will cuddle with the Charles who is here. You can't even see him, but he is indeed sleeping next to me. Anyways, I have quite a few books to talk about today, so I just want to get into it. But as a reminder, there will be no spoilers. I'm not going to be spoiling any of these books, so don't worry if you haven't read them yet. Okay, he just left my lap so I can pick them up. These are the books that I am going to be talking about today, and let's just dive right in. I think I'm actually going to go in order of when I read them because I can do that, so I'm just like reversing the pile here. So the first book that I ended up reading in March, or at least like the one that I may have talked about some books that I read in March in my last recent reads video. I don't quite remember at the moment, but the first book that I haven't talked about and I read in March is When We Lost Our Heads by Heather O'Neill. This book is super bizarre. It's not at all what I was expecting. I honestly didn't really know what to expect from it. I just knew it was like a historical fiction that was set in Montreal, and I was like, oh cool, like that seems right up my alley, but that's not really what it is. It's more like an alternate history story. Like it's one of the weirdest books that I've read in a while, and honestly I can't decide if I like enjoyed that element of it or not. I think I did, but I think it also has kind of left me wanting to read like something else that is what I thought this book was going to be, like a historical fiction that is actually a historical fiction set in Montreal. But nonetheless, it's kind of like a feminist, sort of like Marie Antoinette French Revolution retelling, and they're sisters, and there's like this really weird relationship that is very intense, and honestly I don't even know what to make of this one. It kind of confuses me. Like it's kind of about class divide and those sorts of things. It touches on that, like definitely very French Revolution-esque. I think it's kind of like a retelling of that as much as you can kind of do a historical retelling. But it's one that like I don't quite know what to make of. I really struggle to kind of compile my thoughts for this one because it was so out there and so different and unique. So if you're looking for a unique read, this is definitely a great one to go with. But I know that The Lonely Hearts Hotel by this same author was really popular a while ago, and I had heard of that book, but I didn't really put the two and two together until recently. So maybe I'll give that one a shot because I think that one is also set in Montreal. But yeah, I really don't know what I think about this one. Next up is A Million to One by Adiba Jagirdar. So I haven't read anything by this author, but this is actually the author of The Henna Wars, which was once again a book that was really popular when it came out. I do have a copy, I just haven't gotten to it yet, and she also actually has another book that is out, but this one for sure intrigued me because it is set on the Titanic, and if you guys have been watching me for a while now, then you might know that like I have always kind of had, like when I was a kid, I've had a weird obsession with shipwrecks, like specifically the Edmund Fitzgerald. I was so obsessed with and like spent hours on the phone with my friend talking about and like Googling, which is so strange when you think about it, but I was obsessed, okay? Like Tonight on the Titanic, the Mary Pope Osborne Magic Tree House book was my jam. So anytime there is like a YA historical fiction or even just a historical fiction in general that comes out that is set on the Titanic, I need to read it. And this one is a historical fiction, but it's like a heist on the Titanic. So it is a new twist and kind of take on that story. And I did like this one, but I think that there was kind of a little bit something missing for me. I really wanted to fall in love with it, but I didn't quite get there. I just didn't enjoy it as much as I had wanted to. It was like a really interesting dynamic and an interesting take on that storyline that I have read many, many times before, but I don't know. For me, it was just kind of a bit forgettable, honestly, which I'm really sad to say. I think it's worth the read 100%, but it's not one that like sticks out to me as being one of my favorite like historical fictions or my favorite Titanic ones either, if that makes sense. So not a bad one, but it was just okay and I wanted to love it. Next up, I finally read Aikashara Wheeler by Casey McQuiston. So this is the latest book by the author of Red, White, and Royal Blue and One Last Stop. And this is actually that author's first YA book. So I was super excited that they were deciding to venture into the YA space. And I think that they did a really good job with their first book, but my one thing with this one was that the whole time I could not help but think of Paper Towns. It reminded me so much of Paper Towns in so many different ways, and I kind of found that like it affected my enjoyment a little bit. I don't think this was a bad book. I did like it once again, but I wanted to love it, especially after I had enjoyed One Last Stop so much, which I read at the end of 2022, and I also like really loved Red, White, and Royal Blue. So I was like, cool, like a YA, that sounds amazing. But for me, it just kind of felt like a book that I'd read before. And I will say, like, the main character is really, really realistic, and that can kind of grate on you a little bit because she reads as a very realistic teenager. She's like deeply flawed, makes dumb decisions just because she doesn't really know yet. She's still growing up and she's still learning, but as a reader, that can kind of grate on your nerves. However, if you are looking for like a realistic depiction of a teenager and like the kind of decisions that they will make, this is a good book. Not my favorite by her. I guess for the start of the month, I kind of went on a string of average reads because the next book that I had to talk about is The Reader by Tracy Chee. Tracy Chee is the author of We Are Not Free, which is a historical fiction that I loved. It was like my favorite book of, I think it was 2021, but this was, I believe, her debut novel. It is a YA fantasy that deals with like reading. There's like this book, it's essentially this world where you can't read, like reading is considered magic, which was super cool, but this is just kind of a case of like the concept for me was a lot stronger than the actual execution. And I'm really sad because I wanted to love this one once again. Like that seems to be kind of the case with all of these books that I started off with in the month of March, honestly. But something about it, it just seemed a little bit like weak and kind of meandering, and I felt kind of bored throughout it. So I wanted to love it so badly, but unfortunately it was a miss. I thought the magic system was super cool, but alas, it wasn't for me. The next book, however, that I read, I did really love, and that is Reggie and Delilah's Year of Falling by Elise Bryant. This is my second Elise Bryant book, and definitely she has made her way to being like an auto by author for me because her books are just so freaking good. So this one, it is about two characters who are like falling in love over the course of a year. They keep on meeting on holidays. They just are happening to meet on holidays, and you're following their relationship kind of from like the beginning when they meet each other to them like slowly falling in love and the flaws that come with that, because each of them are very flawed characters. However, they still manage to be likable, which is kind of like contrasting with Aikashara Wheeler. I felt like these characters, even though they read as really realistic and flawed teenagers, they still were very likable in my opinion. Like I was rooting for them, and I knew that things were gonna blow up because they were kind of like keeping secrets and not really really being fully truthful with each other, and you just know that's going to go wrong eventually, so I was waiting for it to go south. However, I still just wanted things to work out for them in the end. I think that Elise Bryant is just a really strong YA contemporary author, and definitely one that you should check out if you haven't yet, because I also really enjoyed her last book. Like, she writes contemporaries that are super cute, like romantic and fun, but they also pack a punch and have some more meaning to them. Next, I picked up Mysteries of Thorn Manor by Margaret Rogerson. This is like a novella that goes with the Sorcery of Thorn books, and it actually honestly made me want to reread Sorcery of Thorns because I just loved this. This was so much fun as like a cute little wholesome story. It was so nice to be back in that world, and it made me fall even more in love with it. So I feel like I probably will actually reread Sorcery of Thorns at one point because it has been kind of sticking out to me since I read this. It was just so nice to be with the characters again, and I really had a good time with this. I read it super quickly, like it's not very long at all, and it's also just like super small as well. Like, it's not even like a full-size book, but I think it's really fun if you like kind of cozy little fantasies, or you liked the characters, you liked Sorcery of Thorns. Next, I actually picked up another short book, and that is Demon in the Wood by Leigh Bardugo, but this is also illustrated by Danny Pendergast. So I picked this up on a whim when I was doing the first reading sprint live show for my Patreon, so I'll have that link down below if you guys would be interested. But I read this thinking like I wasn't gonna finish it during the live show, but I actually ended up finishing it during the live show, and I was kind of meh at the beginning, but then I was like, oh no, like it was a really cool twist that the story ended up happening. I went into it not really knowing anything. I assumed it was about the Darkling and an origin story there, which it is, so it's a prequel to the Grisha verse, and I thought it really built that character out for me. I loved the art style, and I mean, now that I have read it, like it's not surprising at all that I ended up finishing it during the live show, because it's kind of more like a comic book where there really is more photos or illustrations than there is text, but super quick read and definitely worth it if you are into the Grisha verse. Next, I read 1,000 Miles by Bridget Morrissey. I picked this book up last year when I was starting to kind of like get some more romance books, because for a while I feel like the only romance books that I really had were the ones that were popular and really talked about. But then I was like, no, like I know what tropes I like by now, so I want to start kind of like stocking up on those tropes. And this one is a friends to lovers story, and not only that, it's a childhood friends to lovers story, which is like my absolute favorite. I always used to think that was second chance romance, but I think that people refer to second chance romance more so as like when they broke up and then they get back together. But for me, it was more so like they used to know each other, or they used to be friends, whatever, and then they come together later and get together. Does that make sense? I always got the two mixed up, but childhood friends to lovers is what we're gonna call it nonetheless. But this book was so freaking good. I am such a sucker for the childhood friends to lovers trope. I saw when I was like marking this as read on Goodreads, quite a few people didn't like this one because there's not a lot of conflict in it, but that worked for me. Like honestly, enemies to lovers is not my favorite. I'm not really into that angst, and I felt like this had enough angst to it nonetheless. Like you had the angst of them having this past and they're on this road trip together, and it was really good. I loved the chemistry between the two characters, and I loved the characters themselves, and it definitely has made me want to read more by this author. But yeah, if you like friends to lovers or like childhood friends to lovers, this is a really great one that I feel like I haven't seen anywhere else. Just took a chance on it, but it's enjoyable. Next, I read In 5 Years by Rebecca Searle. So I've read one other book by this author, and that was One Italian Summer, which came out last year, and I enjoyed that one. And she kind of writes contemporary romances with a twist. That's kind of her thing. Now this one my sister had read. Like I had a copy that the publisher had mailed to me, and then I ended up giving it to my sister, and then I ended up repurchasing it because she had enjoyed it so much. So I did like this one. It was not at all what I expected it to be. The story kind of starts one way and then goes a different way, and also I thought it was going to spend more time in the future. Like essentially on the night when her boyfriend, like everything in her life is going as she would have planned. The main character, she like has just had an interview for her dream job and it seems like she's going to get that, and then her boyfriend proposes to her. Everything seems great, and then she wakes up 5 years later and she wakes up in a totally different apartment. She wakes up next to a totally different guy, is like very confused, but she's only there for like half an hour or something, and then she ends up like going back to reality, and then it's following the 5 years, seeing like, I don't know, how does she get there? Like, what was that? And it's definitely very fascinating. But yeah, it's one that makes me think, like even just talking about it now, it makes me think. I feel like this would be a really interesting book to do a book club for, because there are a lot of thoughts. I have a lot of thoughts on it, and I don't know. It's hard for me to wrap my brain around it, honestly. The more I think about it, the more I'm like, what did I even read when I read this one? Like, it was kind of one of those books, but it has a really beautiful friendship in it, and it was fascinating. I read it in one sitting because eventually I just wanted to know like what was going to happen in the end, and I was very emotional, but it was quite good. My next March read was The Dictionary of Lost Words by Pip Williams. I think I also actually read this one in a day. I kind of remember like it was one of those books that just sucked me in and I didn't want to put it down, so I didn't. I just sat there and I listened to the whole audiobook, and it's one of the things that I love about adult books is when they follow the main character from a very young age and then you get to see them like grow up, and that is exactly what happened in here. You're following the daughter of one of the lexicographers at Oxford, who they're putting together the very first Oxford English dictionary, and you're following her from like being in the room where those things are happening, and she is like sitting on the floor and waiting for these words to be dropped, and then she takes them and is like making her own dictionary, and then she starts gathering words that kind of like an Urban Dictionary origin story, honestly. She's gathering it from people who aren't necessarily the elite, aren't necessarily people whose opinions are taken into account, and especially women. She's gathering these like crude words that would not normally end up in the OED, and she is making her own little dictionary there. And I just thought this was such a fascinating story. It's actually based on, I don't think it's like true events, but based on her own actual research. Okay, yeah, it is actually inspired by actual events. So the author delves into the archives of the Oxford English Dictionary to tell this original story. And honestly, it was so good. This is one of those historical fictions that gets you thinking, and I will be recommending this one a lot. I think it is underhyped because I thought it was amazing, and like it focuses on those stories that aren't normally told, and those stories that do matter, and those voices that do matter, and I loved that. Okay, and the last book that I ended up reading in March was Love on the Brain by Ali Hazelwood. This was good. It was a solid, like, not sci-fi, but like she has these like scientific romances dealing with women in STEM, and this one focused more on the science than the love hypothesis did. And ever since people pointed out how much she talks about like how big the love interests are, that was all that I could read when I was reading this one. That was all I could think about, was how often she is talking about that, like, he's just huge in every single way. And I'm like, we get it, he's a big boy. But anyways, this one was fun. It was cute. The characters definitely had chemistry. It was more of like an enemies to lovers storyline, but it was the kind of enemies to lovers that I enjoy, where like there's not much to the enemies side of things, but like things kind of took a turn in like, I don't know, 3/4 in, like when you're getting to the climax, there's like this weird kind of out of place like action thing, and I was like, this doesn't really make sense to me. So then I was kind of off board, but overall I did enjoy this one. I think that Ali Hazelwood writes like really cute and quick romances. Okay, so those are all of the books that I read in March. Actually, the ones that I had already talked about I talked about them in my last recent reads video, so I can link that down down below for you guys. But I started off the month with 2 books that I didn't talk about today, and that is Wild Woman in the Blues by Denny S. Bryce, which I reviewed in that last video, and then I also DNF'd A Magic Steeped in Poison by Judy I. Lin, which I talked about in that last video as well. Those are all the books that I read in March, so now I need to go and film the video talking about the books that I read in April, so then I don't fall behind with these wrap-ups and I'll be all caught up. But thank you guys so much for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed. Let me know if you have read any of these books, your thoughts on them, because I would love to know, and I will see you guys in another new video very soon. Bye!